everyone. The video you're about to watch is the second in a series that I'm doing with Zevi Slavin on the work of the Jewish Neoplatonic thinker Ibn Gabirol. The first one was already publicly available. Normally, we don't make the second and third videos publicly available. They just go to the Lectern community. But I was so impressed by what happened in my conversation with Zevi. It became genuine, deep dialogos, and a lot was emergent, very powerful, that was also very pertinent and relevant to the current context. That I talked to Ben and some of the other tech people, and I said, I want this one to go also public. And so that's why we're releasing this publicly. I think you'll see why. I think in some ways, this second video in the series is better than the first. There's a third one that's going to be coming, but please enjoy this one. Welcome, everyone. This is episode 2 in a Lectern series with my dear friend, Zevi Slavin. We're doing a discussion on the philosophy of Ibn Gabirol and various important ideas that come up about it. I won't review everything. I'll just hit a couple of high notes from the previous episode 1. But before I do that, and before I welcome Zevi, I want to point to 2 books. One I mentioned last time. This is one of the single best books getting into the depth. Ibn Gabirol's Theology of Desire, Matter and Method in Jewish Medieval Neoplatonism by Sarah Pessin. I believe that's how she pronounces her name. Excellent. And then after, this came to me after Zevi and I had recorded our first discussion. I knew it was on the way. Here is the book, the recent book, not cheap, by the way, on Ibn Gabirol, Latin and Hebrew Philosophical Traditions, edited by Nicola Polani, Marienza Benedito, and Federico Dalbo. And there's an excellent recent article by Sarah Pessin in here that really helped clarify some issues that were still unclear as I was reading her book and talking to Zevi. I made a public note last time, but I'll do it here also vocally. I made a mistake last time, and I said that Ibn Gabirol influenced Erigena, which is impossible since Erigena was hundreds of years before him. What I meant was he influenced Duns Scotus, and he was a deep influence on Eckhart, and he reminded me a lot of Erigena, and my reconstructive memory sort of smushed those together. So I apologize. I've made the correction. We can go on. Now, a couple of the key notes for Ibn Gabirol was a reformulation of matter, which had gone from a very negative, classically in Plotinus, matter is the locus of evil. It is inert in the most profound sense. It has no form, no life, no mind. It's evil. And of course, modernity inherited that to some degree with its notion of matter as dead and inert and lifeless. Not so much evil, but nevertheless, the idea that it is inherently resists us is what sort of survived of that. So there's a deep influence there. Ibn Gabirol represents a fundamental reformulation, and that's how he reminds me of Erigena, in which matter goes from being just a single strata of his ontology at the very bottom to showing up in many places. And there is a very high form of it called universal matter. And he has a different understanding of matter. He understands matter as that which longs for form, and it has desire, and therefore it's an immediate expression of God's loving nature and God's desire in the loving sense to bring things into form. And it's almost a Taoist notion of matter as the sustainer of things, that which holds them in being in an important way. And I intend the pun here. He picks up on a maternal side of matter that was always inherent there. And then that starts to transform how he understands the cultivation of wisdom, how he understands being apophatic. And Zevi and I really sunk our teeth into that. And we got into this idea of like the way almost we could say matter and form seeking each other, and that the irada, the desire of God, is the glue, the relational glue of this mutual longing for each other, which was very interesting. And that picks up on one deep influence in Ibn Gabirol, which is he seems to be influenced whether directly or indirectly by the tradition of Empedocles. Whether or not it's actually Empedocles or a pseudo-Empedoclean tradition doesn't really matter, because we're just talking about the ideas here, not the exegesis. And so this is a very profound proposal, because it opens up the possibility of a radical rethinking of matter as in between the classic Neoplatonic evil is pure privation and evil, and the modern evil is, matter is not evil. Matter is the resisting, inertial, inert, dead stuff from which everything is fundamentally built in a completely bottom-up fashion. And Ibn Gabirol gives us something in between those. He gives us this dynamic, layered ontology in which things are proceeding and returning and also remaining, that famous triad of functions within Neoplatonism. And it's very vibrant, and I think it's very consonant with a lot of the work I've been doing with Greg Enriquez on extended naturalism, a species of this broader genus of what's called liberal naturalism, a naturalism that rejects reductionism, and instead thinks we need a much more layered, dynamic ontology in order to account for the four M's: mind, meaning, matter, and math, things much beloved by the Neoplatonist. So that's a bit of a quick overview of who we're talking about, why we're talking about him. The reason I want to talk to Zevi is, first of all, Zevi is brilliant and he's got a shining heart. And I love talking with him. I just love spending time with him. I hope someday we can spend some extended time together in person. I would really hope that would happen. Secondly, he does a lot of work on Seekers of Unity, what his great channel is called, which is about mysticism, and Neoplatonism figures largely in that. Apophatic theology and mysticism play a significant role in Ibn Gabirol, both in his poetry and in his great philosophical work, The Fountain of Life. And something we're going to zero in a little bit more on today that we didn't. Ibn Gabirol is within the grand tradition, and he's very influential within what's called Jewish philosophy. Whether or not we should have a category like that is something I want to ask Zevi. But that's what we're going to talk about. But first, I'll let Zevi say hi and introduce himself, and then we can get into it.
So good to be here with you, John. If I knew that getting into this line of work and public scholarship would bring me into friendship and conversation and ongoing dialogue with people like yourself, I would have done it much sooner. But it's a true pleasure. And being able to, whatever it is I'm doing in my life, to take time out to think about questions about the history of philosophy, and maybe more importantly about the nature of being as mediated through these great thinkers in the history of philosophy together with you, is a real pleasure and delight. So glad to be here with you. I am the content creator and educator behind the YouTube project primarily called Seekers of Unity, where we seek to understand what is it that unites the great philosophical mystical traditions across time and across cultures. And how does a message and wisdom from those traditions unite with our contemporary understandings of ourselves and reality? So uniting ourselves across time and sort of horizontally and vertically in an attempt to live artfully and wisely and kindly. And very glad to be, as we said last time in the previous conversation, thinkers like Ibn Gabirol are so central to my thinking and my project, and to your projects and your thinking, John. And what a beautiful opportunity to be able to bring them to life in the Borchian sense, when we get to step back in time and be in dialogue with them, and they come alive with us in these conversations.
Beautifully said. So first of all, is there anything? I mean, that wasn't an attempt at a complete, review of everything we did. I was just trying to hit the high notes. Is there a high note or two you might want to add, or do you want to just get into the conversation?
Yes, I think it was fair to mention that Ibn Gabirol gives us a profound, positive is an understatement, divine conception of matter.
Yes,
that is incredibly novel, and people, we think in terms of we paint many thinkers that fall into one school as if they all have the same ideas. So if someone's a pre-Socratic or a Neoplatonist, they all think the same thing, and that's very much not the case. And we see that with Ibn Gabirol's take on matter, as you so beautifully articulated. The other subject of conversation, which is very much entwined with his innovation of matter, was his innovation on how do we translate it? Will, desire.
Yes, yeah.
And that was, I think, the bulk of last conversation, if I remember, we're circulating around trying to get a grip on those ideas of his, and then trying to put them into relationship with contemporary models of reality and meaning making.
Yes, yes, excellent. That's very good. Yeah, we might come back to irada. I believe that's how it's pronounced, which is like, Pessin argues that we should translate it as desire. It's traditionally translated as will, but she also just often leaves the term untranslated, very much like people have decided to do with the Greek term logos, because none of the translations are adequate. When you try and convey into English, you get this polysemous sort of family of terms, and there's something deep and there's something really profound there going on. And I think I want to come back to this. I think it has something to do with the work I've been doing around voluntary necessity. We talked about this, I believe, and how that plugs us into something about reality that is deeply primordial, but is often also deeply backgrounded by us. But let's first tackle, because I'm going to bring back that stuff about voluntary necessity and desire when we do poetry and philosophy. But I want to pick up on something that we only had so much time, but one of the things that is interesting, right? And I like this text, Latin and Hebrew philosophical tradition. It's one of the first texts that really works hard to try and balance this out, because typically what happens, and this is one of Avicebron, which is one of the Latinizations of his name, and he gets taken up and he has an influence on Aquinas. And a lot of people, there's been a lot of scholarship about how he gets taken up into the Latin West. And often he gets, as you did with your beautiful story of the fig tree, he gets buried and he's giving birth to all this wonderful stuff, but often unacknowledged. But this book addressed a concern that I have, which is, I understand why we need to do that, because we're trying to say, how does he plug into, I don't know what to call it, the mainstream right now of the West, or something nebulous like that. But I'm interested, and this is something where I'm only starting to get, so I'm largely ignorant, so I'm trying to ask this very tentatively. How is he fitting into the tradition of Jewish philosophical thought? How is he, in which you see something at least structurally analogous, to the way we see, Dionysius and Aquinas wrestling with Neoplatonic thought in Christianity, or we see aspects of what's going on with the Ismailis or the Sufis wrestling with Neoplatonism and Islam and something. And I have a sense that something like that could be the case, that he's wrestling. He's in a context in which he's surrounded by Muslims. And of course, Christianity is not far away either, because the time he's in, it's under Muslim rule, but the Reconquista is beginning. The Spanish are reconquering Spain. So all of this is going on. There's a lot of mixture. And so That's what I'm concerned with. How do I want to properly situate him within his home tradition? How does that tradition lead up to him? What does he influence, give birth to? How do you, stepping outside that horizontal historical, how do you, Zevi, as a deep reflector on, the deep connections between philosophy and religion? That's one of the things you frequently try to, weave. How do you see him in that framework? So I'm trying to pose this question as broad and as neutrally as possible, because I don't want to prejudice it in any way.
Yeah. These are important and challenging questions to answer. I think let's begin like this. There's a general question in scholarship of philosophy and history of philosophy whether the term Jewish philosophy or the Jewish philosophical tradition is a legitimate term at all.
Yes.
And just to give some background and context, because I think that framework might be an important way into that question here. So one question is, what is Jewish about Jewish philosophy? Is it just Jews doing philosophy? Which then begs a broader question, which is, how do we correctly use the term philosophy at all? Mm-hmm. Is philosophy the term which is supposed to be restricted to thinkers emerging from the Grecan tradition, from where we get the term philosophy itself, philosophia, the love of wisdom, Greek term? Or are we to conceptualize of philosophy as a broader human activity, thinking about the nature of reality, the nature of thought, ethics, thoughts on thinking, to use a Greek phrase. And even as we try to articulate that, we're using Greek categories. But with the conception of a category that is philosophical thought, are we to conceptualize that as a properly human activity and therefore something which is done across cultures and across times? And there's strong advocates on both sides, and I'm going to pause once I set up the framework, and I'd love to hear your thoughts here, John, because I'm sure you've given some deep thought to this. But the sort of the broad arguments for one or the other in terms of whether we are to consider philosophy as something universal or something Greek and its derivatives, which I think is and either way that we answer that question will affect how we see Ibn Gabirol in his context. One answer is to say that if we deny other cultures that are non-Grecan in origin of having something called philosophy, then we are somehow looking down upon them as if they are not worthy of ascending to this level of thought called philosophy, this level of human activity. And therefore, in the study of philosophy, non-Western, non-Grecan traditions have been historically undervalued. African philosophy, Eastern philosophy, etc. On the other hand, the counter argument is that applying this Greek term philosophy to other traditions is to superimpose something which is not theirs onto them. And in that sense, we're also doing a violence to those traditions by saying, oh, we have a label for you, as opposed to asking the tradition itself to self-identify and not impose something on it from the outside which it may not be interested in. And that's a bit of and maybe that's a meta question here and I want to turn that question to you before we dive into the question of what then would it mean to be to do Jewish philosophy. So I'm trying to answer the question of what is philosophy first, and then we can talk about what is Jewish and then what is Jewish philosophy.
Excellent. So I think to where does my thinking come down on this? I think that for arguments you're well familiar with, wisdom is not optional. Human beings are beset individually and collectively, culturally and historically, by powerful processes of self-deception and ways in which they sever their relationship to themselves, to other people, to the world, that causes harm to them, that causes harm to others, and causes harm to the world. I think this is a perennial problem, and it has very many aspects. Human beings can cross-culturally, cross-historically fall into despair. They can fall into a kind of depravity. They can fall into anxiety. They can fall into alienation. There does not seem to be any literature across the world that does not point to human beings being subject to this deep kind of fallibility. And as you know, I think there's a reason for that. I think the very processes that make us intelligently adaptive make us perennially prone to the possibilities of self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. Insofar as that's the case, I'll now add another premise based, again, on a lot of other arguments I'm not going to review that you're also familiar with. I don't believe that there is a panacea practice. I don't believe there is a single antidote to this. Our cognition is inherently very complex. It's evolving, it's adaptive, it's embodied and embedded. And therefore, we need a complex ecology of practices in order to address that, in order to ameliorate the severance and the suffering from the self-deception, in order to enhance the connectedness and the flourishing that it brings. I also think that because a lot of our knowing is not properly carried propositional, again, I won't review all those arguments, that we not only need text, we need role models and communities to help us in this. I think, therefore, we are going to find perennially human beings coming up with ecologies of practices that are designed to cultivate wisdom, and that try and do that by role modeling and inculcating a love of wisdom that can overcome the inherent egocentrism and all this that's at the source of a lot of our biases, the fact that that we're subject to temporal discounting, and so we can't pursue all of that stuff. I won't review all the cogsci. Now, that means something like religion is going to be perennial, given that. And if we think of an ecology of practices, if we think of role models, if we think of traditions, if we think of the love. And here's where I would, I defer to Pierre Hadot. The line between religion as a practice for inculcating the love of wisdom and attempts to dialogically discuss and reflect upon this and thereby improve it, that were born in the axial revolution in multiple places around the globe, which is, we could bring what Bella calls second order thinking to bear on our religious love of wisdom. I think that is also, a perennial possibility and power of human beings. Now, the question is it completely universal? Does every culture have philosophy in the sense that I'm talking about here? I don't know. But is it limited to the Greco-Roman heritage? No, because the axial revolution wasn't limited there. And I think there is a philosophical tradition in India. Now, what's interesting there, and I'm almost done, is there's no clean line between, and it's not drawn in the culture itself. In Vedanta, there's no clean line between religion and philosophy. Buddhism, no clean line between religion and philosophy. But the same thing in Chinese thought. There's no clear line between philosophy and religion in Taoism. And so if we broaden our category to mean there's a religious orientation towards the cultivation of wisdom upon which second order thinking can be brought to bear, then I think it is legitimate to talk about philosophical traditions outside of the Greco-Roman heritage. That's a long answer, but you get, that's a hard question.
I was going to say, I'm so glad that I posed the question to you, because that's such a beautiful Vervaekean definition upon which we can move forward with clarity into this conversation. And what a shining definition that is. So thank you. A religious orientation to the cultivation of wisdom. Okay, so given that definition, I'm going to proceed on the assumption that that's what we're talking about when we mean philosophy. I want to put forward a position here
Sure.
which is that there are Jewish philosophers and there are Jewish philosophers, which means that there are Jewish philosophers who are engaging with the religious orientation to the cultivation of wisdom through the Greco-Roman lenses and frames of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and their descendants. And Jews are doing that. Jews like Maimonides, Jews like Spinoza, Jews like many Isaiah Berlin, many great
Right.
Jews who are engaging in a religious orientation, the cultivation of philosophy. And then there is a different type of Jewish philosopher who is not engaging with the Grecan categories of thought, but is engaged in a religious orientation to the cultivation of wisdom, doing it within Jewish categories, within Hebraic, Semitic, Judaic, whatever term we want to use for the appropriate moment in time categories. And I think the first example that comes to mind is someone like Isaiah Horowitz, the Maharal, who is very much aware of the Greek tradition, and I'll give some sort of criteria of how I'm making this distinction. I think the criteria is very much a question of hermeneutics. So there's a classic distinction within the history of Jewish literature between what a term that's used for philosophy. So the same way that philosophy gets translated into Arabic, and you have a tradition of falsafa, for example, or you have a tradition of kalam. So within Judaism, you have a tradition of chakira, which is the Hebrew word for investigation, and a choker is a philosopher in Judaism. But a choker is a philosopher of the Greek sense. So a Jew doing philosophy in a Greek style, and Maimonides is perhaps the choker, the philosopher in that sense in Judaism. On the other side of chakira, you have drash, you have the exegetical tradition of Judaism, which is the rich hermeneutical tradition of Jewish textuality, of reading texts in relationship to earlier texts and to the contemporary moment. And in opposition to the choker, the philosopher in Judaism, you have the doresh or the darshan. And I think great texts like the Zohar, great texts like the Medrash Rabbah of the sages of the Talmudic period are not. They're aware of the Greek thing that's going on, even within their own tradition. They are not doing that. They're doing a religious orientation to the cultivation of wisdom through Jewish categories, if I can use that term. And those are Jewish hermeneutical categories, and those are the exegetical practice. And it's very evident when one is engaging in an exegetical Jewish practice, because you are taking earlier texts and you are reading them with a very fine comb, and you are finding wisdom within those readings and rereadings and subversive readings. And there's been a tremendous amount of academic scholarship on this practice, on the practice of Jewish drash. If the leading scholars on that, their names are slipping my mind right now. But there's Christine Hayes, I believe, is one such scholar who has written on drash extensively. There's James Kugel. There are some fantastic scholars that have covered that subject exhaustively. I don't know about exhaustively, but comprehensively from within an academic context. On that distinction, so a religious orientation to the cultivation of wisdom through Jewish categories or Jews doing it through Greek categories, I would say that, and it's very clear when one is doing. It's very clear when one is doing one or the other. So Hasidic texts, for example, are very much exegetical and are rereading earlier texts in creative ways. It's clear that they're doing Jewish. They're also engaging in categories that are being inherited from the Greek tradition, right? And many of them are coming through Ibn Gabirol.
Yeah. I was going to say.
Yeah. So I'm presenting it as if they're clear.
No, but they bleed, right? They bleed into each other.
Yes, there's a lot of bleed. Yes. The ideas from the Grecan tradition, mediated through people like Ibn Gabirol, primarily, and Maimonides, are coming into Jews who are doing this cultivation of wisdom through the Jewish hermeneutical and exegetical category. So there is, while the methodologies are clearly distinct, there is a tremendous amount of bleed, and we can talk about that. When it comes to Ibn Gabirol's...
Go ahead. No, finish. I don't want to interrupt. I thought you were done. Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was going to say, do you see different aspects of his work that emphasize one over? I think the Fountain of Life is clearly him using the Greco-Roman categories, and he's reflecting deeply on them. But when I read some of his poetry, I get a sense that he's much more. He's often alluding to Hebrew texts, to the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible, I should say, sorry, and things like that. And I'm not trying to say it's cleanly, that the prose is philosophy through Greek categories and the poetry is philosophy through Hebrew categories. But I was sensing a difference there, and I'm wondering if you feel that at least has some plausibility to it.
Precisely. I think that when it comes to his philosophy, like his Fons Vitae, it's known by a Latin term. The original Arabic and Hebrew, the Semitic is we're aware of them, but it's lost to the history of philosophy in some sense. Even the identity of the author, right? We don't know that he's a Jew until 1846, right? So, and that's very intentional, because he's not citing earlier Jewish sources. He's not coming across as, he's not doing the cultivation of wisdom through Jewish categories. And I would say, yes, that in his philosophical work, he, and this is kind of the cliffhanger here, I don't think, yes, he's a Jewish philosopher, but he's not a Jewish philosopher using Jewish categories of cultivation of wisdom. He's a Jewish philosopher using Greek categories of cultivation of wisdom, which is why he's lost to Jewish history in many ways. The part of him which remains part of Jewish history is his poetry. His poetry is heavily Jewish, yes, in a properly. And when I say Jewish here, I don't mean bagels and lox. I mean Jewish in a deep relationship to the history of Jewish textuality and the ways that Jews have historically read our texts and continue to do so. And in that sense, and even then, he's not cleanly Jewish. There's a lot of Arabic poetic influence that he's dealing with, of course. But in his poetry, and those poetries make their way into literature. We just commemorated just yesterday Jewish high holidays, and his poetry makes it into the liturgies of many synagogues around the world. And so in that sense, I think there is a distinction between his poetic and his philosophical, which in some ways maps onto the great later contemporary of his, Maimonides, who also has a distinction between his great philosophical work of The Guide of the Perplexed, which is not Jewish in a hermeneutical sense, I would say, versus something like his major halachic work, which is an equal magnum opus in Jewish literature, maybe even more within Jewish communities, which is thoroughly Jewish in what he's doing and in the way that he's doing it. So I think that we see a thinker like Ibn Gabirol, who is a Jew thinking and writing Jewishly in one area and thinking and writing Greekly in another area. To complicate that a little, I think there is bleed between them, as you said earlier. And a question that I wanted to lead up to and maybe pose to you is to think about what is Jewish then about his philosophy, right?
Well, so what was coming to mind as we were doing this, and as I was listening to you, was Catherine Pickstock's work on liturgy and philosophy, and and how philosophy in the West has lost its connection to liturgy. You see very similar arguments in the Eastern Orthodox tradition by Yanaris and Zuzilas. I don't know how he pronounces his name, about the ecclesiastical liturgical setting, and only in that setting can you understand the cognition that is going on there, which as a 4E cog scientist I take very, very seriously. And again, somebody who takes ritual ways of knowing as distinct and non-reducible to propositional ways of knowing very seriously. So I often use very broadly the term liturgy or theurgia to try and cover all of that. And then, of course, now I'm invoking, again, the relationship between philosophical discourse and theurgia in people like Iamblichus and Proclus, where you also see these two things at work. And I think there is something. I think there is something. There's a long argument here, but I'm getting progressively. There's something personal. Now, I don't mean an individual substance by the word personal. The best quick snapshot is Huber's I thou, right? There's something personal. You have to be in the I thou framing, that personal framing for liturgy to work. And therefore, your heritage and your faith, meaning what is calling you from your depths to your heights, or to the heights, if you want to put it that way. What is calling from another one of my favorite Psalms is deep calling to deep, right? That is inherently, inextricably bound up with where you are orienting from, which I think for most people, even secular people, is deeply religious in nature. It is how we are religio, how we are bound. And so while I might say that as a scientist, there are universal processes at work so that we can compare and dialogue between these, I think there's going to be something personal and in that sense, historically and culturally specific to the liturgical or theurgic aspect of this. But I definitely still think, and that's what I'm trying to say, that it is a profound way of, and in fact, this is where I really agree with her. This is a deeply profound way of cultivating wisdom. And in her part, she makes reference to the fact that if you go back to Socrates, and this is Rafe Kelly's point, the academy and the gymnasium and the shrine, the glade, are all together, right? The liturgical, the athletic, and the dialogical are like this. And so just as I think that Greek religious orientation bleeds into the philosophical discourse, and we just take it for granted as the conceptual categories, I think Ibn Gabirol's religious orientation is inextricable from the liturgical theurgic that is in a proper partnership with reflective philosophical discourse. Sorry, another long answer, but these are really deep questions you're asking me.
No, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful meditation there. But what I'm hearing you saying, if I can repeat back, is that the interjection of something which is deeply personal and using that in a depth meaning of the term into one's thinking is what brings with it a degree of religiosity and liturgy and theurgy and poetry, perhaps even. Yes. And in doing so, one is bringing the particularism of their own personhood and their own culture and their own people into their thinking. And when the Greeks are doing philosophy, although we have in the past understood them to be sort of armchair distant thinkers, we now have a much better conception where these are fundamentally religious people engaged in highly personal, deeply personal engagements with the nature of reality, and thinking about it. And then when someone like Ibn Gabirol is doing that, he's also bringing himself into it. I think it's interesting. I think that as a Neoplatonist and as a philosophical Neoplatonist in the Hadoian sense, where this is deeply practiced, deeply experienced, deeply participated, and not just theorized in a thin meaning, modern meaning of that word. That he is engaging with the fullness there. And to me, the question that's kind of coming up is that fullness of engagement for someone like Ibn Gabirol, and when we read his words and try to intuit what is going on, is it a fullness of his humanity, of that he is human, that he's bringing into the text, or is it also that he is a Jew that he's bringing into the text, into his philosophical text? Because I have no doubt that he's engaging with it deeply and fully as a human. But the question is he also, by doing so, engaging with it deeply as a Jew, as he is clearly in his poetry?
Yes. So let's. Sorry. Well, I'm limited to largely Western terms. I think the people that are trying to do that, we had a historical example, right? Existentialism, in which the personal and the fully human is supposed to play a pivotal role in how one does one's philosophical reflection and generates one's philosophical arguments. You get it in Heidegger, and you get it, right? And coming, I'm thinking people like Gabriel Marcel and people like that. And so, is that all that's going on? So to be anachronistic, and I explained that I am, but is it just the case that he's a Jewish guy, happens to be Jewish, and he's doing existential philosophy in which his liturgical practices are, helping him to call forth his humanity? Or is there something about his Jewish relationship to other people and to God that is playing a pivotal role? And I think, well, I'm not saying he's not an existentialist. I think that would be a mistake. I can read him and resonate with him so much because of that existential overlap. But I do think also he has a relationship to the sacred, to the divine, that is inseparable from the imaginal orientation that allows him not just to think about it, but to participate in that. And I think that relationship to ultimacy that reverberates back into sort of the depths of our soul, our primordial presuppositions, I don't think that can be established philosophically, even existentially. I think it is that upon which philosophy, even the existential form of philosophy, has to be pronounced. And therefore, I would say there still is some aspect of his work that I would expect to be properly, ultimately Jewish. Just like when I'm reading Dogen, in the end, the Buddhism matters, right? I mean, it's Zen, and you can put a lot. And certainly, can't you be a Zen Neoplatonist? Yes, possibly. But the Buddhism matters in Dogen in a deep way. And so that's what I mean. I'm talking about, something. We're starting to get into areas of faith here, and where I don't use that word to mean believing things without evidence. I mean, what calls us from our depths, what calls us towards what we experience as most real, that allows us to calibrate reality according to that, and that allows us to deepen our experiences of voluntary necessity, of reason, love, beauty, resonance. That's what I mean by faith. And I don't think that faith is ever abstract. It can't be by its very nature. So in addition to him being a great human being, I think I'm arguing that I would expect there to be, and I'm not trying to prejudge what I've seen, I would expect there to be, nevertheless, there's an irremovable Jewish component, just like there's an irremovable Buddhist component from Dogen, right? Or there's an irremovable Islamic component from Rumi to some degree, or Sohrawardi. Sohrawardi is so Neoplatonic, but there's still, like, the conception of God there. That's the wrong word. That's not the right word. The imaginal participation in God. Like think of Ibn al-Arabi, right? All of these things, right? I think they're irremovable. I think we should stop trying. I mean, this is part of the philosophical Silk Road. We should stop trying to deny people their religious home, but we should encourage them to cultivate a secure attachment in the psychological sense so they can enter into deep philia, deep dialogos with other traditions. And you're exemplifying that. You seem very securely, and I mean that in the positive psychological sense, securely attached to your Judaism as your home, and yet, like secure attachment in the romantic field, it actually empowers you to enter into deep friendships. You're exercising it right now with me, with people who aren't Jewish. And that's, to me, what I'm trying to advocate for. That, to me, is that's what calls to me in the philosophical Silk Road. Can we give up the project of trying to de-home people, help them be homed, while still saying that doesn't, right, preclude you. In fact, it empowers you to enter into deep philia with other people who are in other homes.
100%, John. I'm in full agreement there. And that's kind of you to say that you see that reflected in my being and in my work, and I strive for that. I think that one of the either the lies or the failures of modernity and a product downstream of the Enlightenment and of the Jewish Enlightenment movement that followed in relationship to the general European Enlightenment and modernity, which is the Haskalah movement, was this either lie or failed apprehension that the way to achieve some sort of universal brotherhood was by eradicating distinctions,
Yep.
and that the Jew becomes a meaningful, accepted part of, let's say, German society by becoming a fully German person, and to the absence of their Jewishness. And we have a very clear record historically of where that led to. It didn't make the Jews any more loved by the Germans. That did not work. And that does not work because we do not enter into meaningful relationships of philia and logos with another by abstracting and removing that which makes us from those conversations, or else we are not showing up to that conversation. We precisely show up in the depth of our particularity, individuality, and from there we learn to love each other in our distinctions and differences. And I think that it's such an important question, both theoretically and practically, historically and contemporaneously, when it comes to someone like Ibn Gabirol. And I think it's worth opening up that question wider. You're touching on the question of the possibility of a Zen Neoplatonist. Made me think of this category that we use very commonly, which is the Jewish Neoplatonists. Mm-hmm. And I would include, and Ibn Gabirol is a shining, prime example of that, along with people like Isaac Israeli. And I would include someone like a Middle Platonist, a Jewish Middle Platonist, Philo of Alexandria, yes. Who is so right to be in comparison with someone like Ibn Gabirol, where the question of so what is it that they are doing Jewish in their Greek orientation to the cultivation of, in their religious Grecan orientation to the cultivation of wisdom as Jews, right? So Philo, his Hebrew name is Yedidia, beloved of God, which is maybe where it gets translated into something like Philo. But so what is someone like Yedidia Hakayan of Alexander, or someone like Ibn Gabirol doing in their particular in their individuality that is making them that is bringing that depth of their particularity, of their instantiation in their own cultures into this broader human global project. And I think the direction that I would venture to suggest, and this is why I made sure that we mentioned this at the very beginning, is in the emphasis on this concept of alirada, of divine desire, let's call it. This erotic will which motivates all of reality into being. I think that if we are to investigate his great philosophical innovations, of which we, following many other scholars, have reduced maybe slightly unfairly down to two, which is his notion of divine desire and matter. What he does with matter certainly has ripples in Jewish history and goes on to shape the Kabbalistic world and the Hasidic world, which makes this question a challenging one, because when we ask, so what if his ideas are Jewish, we look downstream from him at Jewish ideas and then look back at him and be like, oh, those are, and the reason that those are Jewish ideas is because of Ibn Gabirol. So Kabbalistic notions, right, of an overflowing infinity, which then returns back to itself and the apophatic. These ideas we think of course, these are core concepts of Jewish philosophical mysticism. Thanks to Ibn Gabirol. So
exactly.
So it's a challenging work. We need to step actually to Jewish thought upstream from him to ask this question properly. And I think that the notion of divine agency, divine desire, terms which become also very, very important in the Kabbalistic movement directly following him, of ratzon and tainug, of divine will, divine pleasure, divine, which are rooted in the Kabbalistic hypostasis of Keser, of the superconscious within the divine Godhead, to use some academic terminology there. I think there's something deeply Jewish there. And I think that scholars have generally pointed out that there's a desire amongst the Jewish Platonists, and I'm using that term to include the Middle and Neoplatonists,
sure,
to reconcile the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, with the Greek thinkers, with Plato and Aristotle. And that's one frame to understand people like Philo and people like Ibn Gabirol. And one of the important things to do in that context is to return agency to a God who, in the first verses of Genesis, seemingly voluntarily creates the world ex nihilo. And the Neoplatonists do not have as much of a, to speak broadly, as much as a voluntaristic notion of a divine agent who creates ex nihilo. Yep. And that's been sort of if you ask a general historian of philosophy, what is it that makes these ideas Jewish, they'll point to that notion of divine agency, which the historian will tell you is their attempt to reconcile Genesis, which is a Jewish document, later inherited by much of the world, but originally a Jewish document, with the Greek philosophical tradition. I want to push that, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I've repeated that, to students in 101 Jewish philosophy classes. I want to push that a step further here, based on your prompting, which is, how did I want to articulate this? There's a distinction made between the philosophy of Spinoza, who we both love, and the philosophy or the thought of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, who I consider myself a spiritual student and disciple of. And this is a distinction which is made by Madame Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, who was influenced by both Spinoza and the Baal Shem Tov, and sits downstream of fruitfully of both of them. And he says that Spinoza has a God to which one cannot pray. One cannot enter into a deep relationship of intimacy with Spinoza's divine. The Baal Shem Tov's God is a God that one can pray to, a God that one can love and be loved by in return. And I don't want to strawman Spinoza. Spinoza has a complex notion of divine love, which is self-divine love and human love, but to create a slight caricature for purposes of illustration, the Baal Shem Tov, who's a near contemporary of Spinoza, and whose metaphysics are in many ways parallel to Spinoza, has an agency, and I'm trying to move away from agency, right? Voluntas in a Latin and Greek sense. I'm trying to move to the sense that there is a person with whom one can be in love and be in deep existential, spiritual relationship with. And God is not a what, but a who. And I think that what someone like Ibn Gabirol is getting to in his deep interrelationship with the notion of desire and the divine, and also the notion of matter, where the matter of his being is sourced in that ocean of the divine matter, the throne of God. I think that might be where I may push that academic historical account of the Jewishness of people like Ibn Gabirol a step further.
That's excellent. That's very powerful. It reminds me of the way Yonaris is making use of Heidegger's critique of the God of the philosophers is not one that you would pray to or dance a ritual around or anything like that. And then Yonaris is deeply critical of any merely anthropomorphic or individualized substance. Zizulias calls it individualized and individualizing substance, and these are very pejorative notions. But I think that's right. sorry, I keep qualifying this because we have been trained since the Enlightenment to think of hypostasis and person as an individualized anthropomorphic substance, and that is deeply not appropriate for what we're trying to talk about here. In fact, one of the things that's going on, I think, when we confront somebody like Ibn Gabirol, is we're on this tonos, this creative tension between the impersonal and the personal, because both are leaving something out. The impersonal protects God from being anthropomorphic, from being a thing, from being just the biggest thing in the system of things, Heidegger's critique. But it also leaves out this way in which we feel that ultimacy faces us and calls us, and that our voluntary necessity, our love and our reason bind us so that we participate. And that seems like the kind of relationships we have with persons and not with abstract principles. And so, there's that. And I find that tonos is reverberating also powerfully with the one and the many, the perennial problem that they're all facing. How is God one and the ultimate ground of being, and yet being is clearly many. And I find that those two are deeply interwoven, and I think he's doing something very, very powerful about that I think could be very helpful to people who are perhaps not from a Jewish tradition, but would also help them to recognize that there's an aspect of that. I want to be really careful here, and so I'm asking for your friendship here. But just like there's an aspect of a person that we can't finally get our concepts on, there's an aspect of his Jewishness that somebody who's not belonging to that community can't get their hands on, and has to be properly respected if you think that the shareable philosophical arguments point to the centrality of this personal relation. I tried to say that as balanced as I possibly could. I hope that landed well for you.
Yeah, no, you're always, John, filled with care and sensitivity, and it's not why my brow is furrowed. I'm trying to think through your argument here, and deepen my thinking along with it. The question that's coming up to me is: does the particularity of the other, which we are here celebrating and highlighting as essential to, as paradoxically essential to a universal human project of the cultivation of wisdom and the love of wisdom, does the particularistic aspect of that preclude, or definitionally preclude, access from someone who is who does not belong to that particularistic identity, who is other in that? Is that necessarily the case?
No, I did speak of
that's a great.
I want to be clear that I'm talking about a very limited kind of restriction on access. I'm not saying that there isn't a lot that can't be shared. I just want go ahead. Right. I just wanted to make clear that that's what I'm trying to point, that I think there's an irremovable, just like, I don't know if you, I can't remember. Do you have a romantic partner, or are you single right now? I can't remember where you're at right now. Or I'm not supposed to ask that question. I was just going to say, whoever you're in relationship with, I am bound to life for Sarah. And there's a lot that, let's say you were in a relationship, you and I could share, and we could help each other. We could bring wisdom to each other. We could be deep friends. But there's something about my relationship to Sarah you cannot get access to because of the nature of the relationship I have with her. That's what I'm. So I'm not trying to say that it's an absolute unknowability to you. But there could be deep friendship between you and I as we compare and dialogue about our respective relationships. We could deepen each other's relationships. We could move each other into greater wisdom in our loving of our partners. But that doesn't mean that you could have full access to what I have with Sarah or what you have with your beloved. That's the analogy I'm trying to use.
No, that's very rich. And I want to move along those lines with you. there's a beautiful expression from a teacher of mine who's now passed, Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Reb Zalman, as he's known affectionately. And he was a great trailblazer in the type of contemporary Jewish perennialism that I'm embarked on, and he referred to this as spiritual voyeurism. That by watching the devotional piety of other practitioners that were not of his own people, that were not Jews, he was moved to greater levels of intimacy in his relationship with God. Spiritual voyeurism is the term that he used. There's a similar and maybe controversial term in the New Testament that Paul uses, that part of the mission of the ministry of Jesus, which is to a Jewish community, which Paul then brings to a wider audience. So Paul's understanding of what Jesus was doing for the Jews, which he now has to wrap his head around theologically as he expands the project of Jesus, is to provoke the Jew to jealousy, which is a term that's being read in many different ways, sometimes disastrously, but on a very generous reading, it is that through seeing the deep philia of another religious practitioner, we can be moved to greater levels. And we have a concept in Judaism of kinat safrin, of the jealousy of scribes that move us to greater wisdom, in that sense. And jealousy, it's a poor translation. So if that term is objectable, then let it be objectable. I don't have a better term for what kina is in that sense. But yeah, so in that sense, I'm in deep agreement with you that there is something that we do on a philosophical philosophical Silk Road of wisdom, that we come to be moved to greater degrees of wisdom and love through being touched and inspired by the other. And I think you're saying something very profound there, John, which is that there is that while we are moved by the relationship of the other, that is not our relationship.
That's right. That's right.
Right. That is not our relationship. And this brings us to an interesting paradox, which is worth fleshing out and thinking about out loud, which is that as conceptualized, certainly within Jewish mysticism, the relationship that the Jew has to God is a profoundly unique relationship, which is not the same relationship that the Christian, the Muslim, the Buddhist, the Hindu has to God.
Yes.
Judaism, including Jewish mysticism, even in its most isolated and at times historically xenophobic articulations, does not deny the non-Jew of a profound relationship with the divine, but it is not the same relationship that the Jew has with the divine.
I tried to explain this as a Gentile to other people who view the Jewish claim, because of the fraught times we're in, as somehow an arrogant claim. And I was trying to say, no, it's not arrogant. And I was trying to use these kinds of metaphors to explain it. So I'm just praising you for bringing this up. I think this is a very pertinent issue, and I'm glad that somebody with your care and nuance can be speaking to it.
Yeah. So let's really get into it. Let's unpack this. I think that the paradox here is that the claim that these traditions are making, and they're not making these claims for anyone else, they're saying these internally in their own language, in their own terms, is that there are multiple and perhaps infinite ways to relate to that which is all of being, and the way in which that relationship happens is unique for one people and another people.
Yeah.
The paradox here, though, is that the same philosophical mystic will tell you that I don't know what the term, that the divine, the sacred, that thing to which and with which we are relating is actually not different than that thing which the Christian, the Muslim, the Eastern.
But this is what I meant, Zevi.
Right.
So this is what I meant, how what we're doing is we're instantiating a emotionally, in the sense of affective and cognitively pregnant version of the problem of the one and the many. It's not just an abstract problem. When we're on the philosophical Silk Road, we're not just confronting it like in metaphysics and ontology, we're confronting it because that's exactly it. Somehow there's this paradox. They are one, but many. And like I say, for me, that is bound up with this other one we're talking about, which is the tonos between the personal and the impersonal. That's why I'm increasingly seeing these two as inseparably bound together. And we have to I'm proposing that we should properly recognize that.
Yes. Yeah. And I think laying that paradox onto these broader paradoxes of the one and the many, of the personal and the impersonal divine, is appropriate. I don't know if it solves the paradox by saying, the thing to which, right, the thing to which we relate is the personal, the thing to which everyone else can, which we are all collectively relating, is the impersonal. I think that might be too simplistic of a way out of the paradox. And I don't know if the goal is to extricate ourselves from the paradox either. And I think the philosophical mystics want to stay in that tension. I'll just finish with this. With one last thought here, which is that there's and my knowledge might be lacking, but there's only one major philosophical mystic that I can think of, at least within the Abrahamic context, who explicitly moves beyond his own particularity, and that's Rumi, who has at many points controversial statements where he says, at this point of relationship with the beloved, I am no longer Muslim, I am no longer Christian, I am no longer Jew. And I know that scholars continue to sort of question how those texts are to be understood and contextualized and translated. But that's an anomaly amongst philosophical mysticism. With philosophers who have all of his metaphysic and maybe even more, but don't say that same statement, which is fascinating.
I think that's right. My proposal about bringing these paradoxes into alignment was not to say that that's going to bring about some resolution. It was to encourage people to sort of stereoscopically look at both, right? To first of all, once you see a really pertinent and pressing, existentially pertinent and pressing problem of the one and the many that we're talking about here, of people like each of us, right? We belong personally to one of the many, but somehow they're all one. Then that might make you a little bit more receptive to the more abstract version of the problem of the one and the many, and why people are wrestling with it. Because it's not just an abstract thing. It has to do with something deep about how we encounter reality, and specifically how we encounter the reality of other persons who come from other homes. But I think the reverse is also the case. The possibility of saying, well, maybe those what look like arcane philosophical reflections in Plotinus could actually give us some way of improving how we try to cultivate friendship across people's religious home and bring about genuine dialogos and genuine philia. But I was not proposing any that mapping would bring about some kind of resolution. In fact, I was trying to do the opposite. I was trying to in sort of promote, this reciprocal stereoscopic vision that would happen. That's what's happening for me, and I'm sharing it when I'm trying to reflect on the philosophical Silk Road. It's like, because what I tried to do, and I bumped up against what we're talking about here, and I confronted it with a lot of honesty. I hope, which is, I committed myself to being very vulnerable and really learning something new so I could love this person and their tradition in a way that I had not yet before. And that opens you up to this problem, like how far can you go on that, which I think is a noble goal, without eradicating the very thing that makes talking deeply to this other person so rich and vibrant. That's why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah, no, I'm in full appreciation of that, and I think that's right to say, and I think that understanding how these questions, which are the perennial questions that accompany the philosophical mystics on their own journeys through life, are questions that are real and existential and deep in many ways, and I think this is one great example. I love that last thing that you just said, that in the process of your own embarking on a philosophical Silk Road, something that you've been engaged with your body, physically, geographically, something that I've been engaged with in heart and mind, that precisely the endeavor to to drink the wisdom, to taste the wisdom of the other, is curtailed by if we believed that we could fully taste and fully apprehend the flavor of the relationship of the other with the ultimate, then that would actually undermine the process of engaging with the other, because that would effectively eradicate the otherness of the other.
Right. Exactly. And then they have no way to afford your self-transcendence. They would only be
correct.
a mere mirror to your self-reliance. That's all they would be.
Correct. Yeah. It would be a philosophical it would be a solipsistic Silk Road.
That's right.
Not a philosophical Silk Road. And there's something very profound about that articulation, that as we dance with people who come from homes other than ours, how do we create the care and respect to allow them to remain other and to allow them to remain beyond our understanding, while we allow them to deeply impregnate and inspire our own understandings?
Well, I mean, again, not a resolution, but an affordance is to try and build, a language, a vocabulary, a grammar that's drawn from the liturgical, the theurgic, as well as the philosophical, reflective, that is shareable, that does not trespass upon the personal vocabulary, if you allow me to extend that metaphor into the non-propositional, right? That's what I see the project as being. And we're doing it here. You and I are doing it. We're trying to. How can notice we're reaching into analogy and metaphor, and we're bouncing between philosophers and bouncing between philosophy and religion as we try to find shareable language that does not trespass on our home, but allows us to move comfortably. In the philosophical sense, I don't mean existential sense. It should disrupt us, but it allows us to move smoothly, I suppose is what I want to say, without hostility. That's what I'm trying to say. Move without, a prejudicial hostility into the commons. It's an attempt to recover the commons in a deep way that, is essential to a community of different homes. And so that's how I answered your question. That is not the same thing as a Hegelian project of here's the system that will fold all the differences into an ultimate totalitarian identity. That I do not think that is possible, and I am deeply suspicious, and I advocate strongly against anybody who proposes something like that, because that has been disastrous historically, as well as just being philosophically profoundly flawed. So that's how I answer. It's like you take up the task of creating creating new language, and that's going to be my segue to our third episode, which is the relationship between that's exemplified in Ibn Gabirol between philosophy and poiesis, where I'm going to go back and almost in a Heideggerian fashion. Poiesis says the creating of new terms, a new grammar, new ways, and prophecy, not in the prediction, but in the reception of something from a sense of a greater reality that brings new language for us. So the two ways in which logos transcends itself in poetry and in prophecy, and how that interacts with philosophy, and how we can maybe use Ibn Gabirol as a reference point for our third discussion. How does that sound to you?
That sounds delicious, John. I'm looking forward to it, and I just want to second what you said there. And I think that our conversation here is exemplary and performative in a positive sense of that, where we are reaching into his language and we're struggling with trying to hold on to his Hebrew and Arabic terms and trying to still have conversation, because you don't speak Hebrew, I don't speak Arabic, and trying to that process itself that we were doing of finding common language. I always thought about my own project as well as creating a universal language of philosophical mysticism that does not replace or eradicate the particularity of language, but provides a common language, as you were saying, that allows us to see that in our commonality we actually share a deep divine identity that Ibn Gabirol gestures towards.
Yeah, and and thank you for that, because we do have historical precedents, analogs. You have Sanskrit, you have Akkadian, of all things, in the Mesopotamian world. You have Latin, you have Greek. You have examples of the transnational, transcultural languages that were used in order to afford the kind of thing we're talking about. So I think this is also a perennial pattern that human beings have engaged in. And it's been just wonderful to do it with you, as always. And as always, I'm going to give you the last word on our conversation for today.
Very generous, John. Yeah, the example which comes to mind, although has always been the example of the language invented by the Polish Jewish ophthalmologist Ludwig Zamenhof, which is Esperanto.
Yes.
And with greater or lesser degrees of success, the motivation behind him creating the language was because of the amount of devastation and violence he saw in his own lifetime, and his understanding that we as humans need to be able to communicate with one another. And he devotes his life to try and create a project of peace that would afford communication without eradicating. And his notion was not that we all stop speaking French, Italian, Hebrew, Arabic, Spanish, and speak instead Esperanto, but that in addition to our individuality, we learn a common language. And I think that so exemplifies the work that you've been doing here, John.
I like that. I might adopt that. I like the idea of a philosophical Esperanto. That is a way to speak of the philosophical Silk Road. That's actually really, I love that. I thank you for reminding about that and reminding me of the motivation and the goal of Esperanto. It wasn't just some sort of hobby. That's really interesting. Thank you so much, my friend.
You're very welcome.
Well, we're going to talk again. Take care.
Thank you for your friendship, and thank you for bringing me on this journey together.
Thank you so much.